Welcome to The Healing Life. I'm Amanda. This podcast is for people committed to healing, not as a finish line, but as a way of living. Every episode, we talk honestly about what it actually looks like to keep choosing healing as life unfolds. When things get better, when they get harder, and when another layer shows up. Let's get into it. Today, I want to talk about one of the most beautiful and important realizations I've had in my healing journey, which is that we are each our own greatest love story. We are the loves of our own lives. We are our longest, most intimate relationship. And I really believe that the quality of every other relationship we have over the course of our lifetime really flows from the quality of the relationship we have with ourselves. So for me, this isn't like self-help, fluff, love yourself. Like, this is a lifelong, nuanced commitment. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is my journey out of, again, a very linear or binary view of this into something that I think is a lot more nuanced and encapsulates the vast human experience. So I'll be honest, self-love wasn't really even a concept for me until my early 30s. I went through a divorce when I was 31 years old, childhood sweetheart, thought this was, the love of my life. We knew each other for, I don't know, like over 10 years, about 10 years before we got married. And then we were married for 8.5. So a long relationship in total. And unfortunately, it was also a very unhealthy marriage. And I lost myself kind of just completely in that relationship. And I did a lot of things to try to salvage it, to try to save it, that in the moment I didn't agree with, I didn't love. And that piece of me, that version of me coming out of that marriage was one of the most broken, shame-filled versions of me I've ever had. And I realized, like, in the first little bit after I don't remember if it was after we separated or after the divorce finalized, but I realized there were so many things I didn't even know about myself. I didn't know what my favorite color was. I didn't know what kind of food I liked, what kind of restaurants I wanted to go to. I didn't know what kind of TV shows I liked or what kind of movies I liked or what I liked to do with my life. That whole relationship was very much, well, we kind of did what my ex wanted and how and when he wanted. And so I had to get to know what felt like to me was this complete stranger, meaning myself. Like I didn't know who I was anymore. And that was really when I started thinking about this concept of self-love. For those of you who know me from the previous podcast, and for those of you who are just getting to know me through this podcast, something you'll learn kind of fast is when I commit to something, I go all in. So I committed to going on this journey of healing my relationship with myself and trying to get to know myself, trying to get to love myself really for the first time ever in my life. And I went all in. Like, I started taking myself on dates. I would go to restaurants all by myself. I actually really loved it because, introvert. And I would try new places, try new items on the menu. I started figuring out what I really loved. I was living in San Antonio at the time. I was stationed there. So, shout out to the food in San Antonio. Oh my gosh. I had so many great options. And so I just started taking myself out on little adventures around town, completely alone. Sometimes I'd go with, buddies in the military or other friends, but I spent a lot of time alone after that divorce, just trying to figure out who the heck I was. I started shopping differently. Like, my ex definitely had preferences for my clothing. And, I never got too crazy with that, but I started experimenting with that a little bit. I started figuring out what colors I liked, not just for my wardrobe, but also in my home, what kind of style I liked to decorate my home in. I took myself to the movies all alone. I started figuring out like, well, do I like that genre of movie? What about music? We had listened to, I guess, primarily country music. And then we kind of got into, well, he was really into heavy metal. So yeah, I've like jumped around in mosh pits, which surprises everyone who meets me in real life. But that was a piece of it. So I did that. And I started figuring out that I don't super love heavy metal music, actually. So that was interesting. And I tried watching different types of TV shows and started figuring out like, oh, I really have a very strong profile in terms of the types of media I like to consume and the themes. And so that was basically like dating myself, I guess you could say. And I found it to be a really rewarding, healing, sometimes anxiety inducing process. And it took a couple years, and I realized who I was. I did a lot of healing work in my heart just around like the identity I walked away from that marriage holding, which was very shame-filled for me. And as I got to know my preferences, as I got to know myself, I then had to grapple with that shame. I had to sit with it. I had to hold it in my arms and make peace with it, make friends with it. I had a lot of body-related shame. My ex-husband was very, how shall I say this, committed to his pornography obsession. And that really, really impacted my confidence, my self-esteem, my feelings of worth in my body, how I showed up in my body, the ways I tried to control my body. That was one piece of it. And then there were things that weren't really associated with my ex at all, just pieces of myself that I have always really struggled with. So I grew up in a cult and I didn't have formal education ever in my life. I had so much shame, and to be honest, I still kind of grapple with this, around my lack of formal education, like formative education. I had so much shame associated with my biological mother's voice in my head. And I realized during that time of self-discovery and trying to heal my relationship with myself that she screamed nonstop in my brain. Everything I did had a filter of her judgment that, it would run through like, oh, I'm going to wear that. That's going to make me look fat. Oh, you want to style your hair that way? That's going to make your face look fat. Oh, you want to make that life choice? Well, you're stupid and worthless. Why would you do that anyways? And it was so oppressive to constantly fight that battle inside myself. And a lot of the stuff that my mom said, I had, at that point in my life, I had data, I had evidence to the contrary, but it didn't matter how much data I collected. What she said still screamed the loudest. And I realized I did not want to live with her in my brain. I didn't want her voice to be the voice that I heard for the rest of my life. So that was actually a really big impetus as well. Like the divorce and that realization about my mom's voice in my head kind of driving my life were two things that just propelled me down this path of learning to love myself and make sure that the voice in my head that I listened to was my own, that the voice I took seriously was my own, that the voice that I allowed to have the most sway over my life choices was decidedly my own. I did a lot of work around values at that time in my life, like figuring out what my values are. And I found that when I could filter decisions through my own values that came from my own heart and my own brain, that was a way I could override my mom's voice. Eventually, I got to a point where, it's a lot less clinical. I don't run everything through a rubric of myself and my values. I think that I've realized, actually, preparing to record this episode, that for a while now, I do think the voice in my head has been my own. The guidance that comes from within is truly me. And of course, there are inputs. There are mentors. There are people I trust, dear friends, my husband, people whose voices really mean a lot to me. They add, but they're kind of like the background choir, and my voice is the frontman in the band. And I'm really so relieved and grateful that I finally achieved that. But I'm telling you guys, it was a long, slow, arduous process of something would come up. My brain would go to, well, at first after my divorce, it was, well, what would he want? Oh, wait, no, he's not here anymore. What do you want, Amanda? What do I want? Okay, cool. And then my bio mom's voice would come slamming into the picture, and then I'd have to stop that and be like, nope, we don't listen to that anymore. What do I think about that? What do I have to say about that? What are my values about that? And I would have to systematically, we're talking dozens of times a day, run through this little protocol. And I think it obviously worked over time. I must have, through that process, created some new neural pathways, because now when something comes up, I'm able to instantly tune into me, and I don't have to go through that really, difficult, tedious process of, all right, we're going to stop that thought. We're going to stop that voice. We're going to replace it with this. We're going to reinforce it with that. But I think that unfortunately, that is part of the journey to knowing and loving yourself, is figuring out which voices you listen to, which ones your decisions are rooted in, and then excavate anything that isn't you or something you want there. You have to figure out, like, does this serve me? Does this input serve me? And if it doesn't, it's got to go. And that's a very intentional process, and it can take time. So what I found was that the process of meeting myself and learning to accept myself, and eventually learning to love myself and give myself nurture and tenderness and compassion, was really unglamorous, really slow, and honestly required some support from trusted people. My best friend, bless her forever, spent untold hours on the phone with me during that period of my life, reinforcing my change of command, to use a military phrase. I had to root out my ex and my mom and a couple other unhelpful, toxic voices from my past and replace them with my own. And she would remind me who I am. Especially at the beginning, she gave me a lot of feedback that helped me name who I am. I would tell her, I'm really worried I'm this, that, or this other thing. And she'd be like, no, Amanda, what I observe in you is that how you actually show up looks like X, Y, or Z. And having that trusted input was so helpful. And I think a good therapist can also be really crucial in that journey, in that like internal transformation. My use of therapy was minimal during that time, but I think maybe it would have gone a little faster and a little gentler had I had professional support. So definitely something to consider if you find yourself at a similar point in your journey. Years later, I became familiar with the work of a therapist named Richard Schwartz. And back in the 1980s, he started noticing that his clients, just in the course of talking about what was going on in their lives, organically described their inner lives, their inner world, in terms of distinct parts. And so out of that, he developed something called internal family systems, or IFS. It's a form of therapy. And at its core is this radical idea that underneath all the hurt, all the trauma, all of the shame and fear, there is a self that is fundamentally whole. That is the piece that is undamaged, no matter what we go through in our lives. So the pieces and parts of us, those experience the damage, those experience the trauma, but the self that is kind of the foundational piece underneath it all doesn't experience damage in the same way. And like I said, I didn't have language for this when I was doing my initial phase of reconnecting with, accepting, and finally, for the first time in my life, learning to love myself. But when I look back at that period of my life and all of the periods of my life, even the times when I was experiencing intense sexual violence as a child, there was always a piece inside me that kept trying, that kept showing up, that kept reaching for healing, no matter how broken I felt. And so under internal family systems, Richard Schwartz would argue that that is the self, that is us in our purest form. It never leaves. And I think that's what I met during that part in my life. I got truly in touch with that foundational, fundamental part of myself for the first time in my life. I had known it was there. Like I said, I believe it's what pushed me forward through the worst moments of my life. But it was the first time I'd ever stopped disassociating enough to be present with myself and to acknowledge that that piece of me was in there and that it was whole and that it existed. And I fell in love with it. I was able for the first time ever in my early 30s to genuinely love myself and mean it when I said, I love me. And that was just such a beautiful period of my life. Getting out of that marriage, expelling my mom's voice from my mind, nurturing myself, like really leaning in with the self-love, with the tenderness and compassion toward myself, taking the time to be with myself, to be present with myself. That was such a beautiful time in my life, and I grew a lot in so many ways during that time. And then lifed on me. In 2021, some of my medical conditions flared up violently. And by 2022, I was so sick, I almost died. I had to medically retire from the military to get the level of care I needed. And the person I was really from mid-2022 until I'm still working through it is the most burned out, fried version of myself I've ever been. And somewhere in there, I fell out of love with myself. I think a lot of it is because of the shame that I didn't show up as a severely ill person the way I wanted to. You know, in my dreams, I would have just been this gracious, wonderful person who rolled with everything and never got mad about anything and was just so kind and tender no matter how much agonizing pain I was in. But that is not the story that is true. The story that is true is that I got sharp and hard, and I snapped at the people I love most, and the burnout ate up my personality. And I feel like that self that I had worked so hard to find just vanished from view, just was not accessible to me during that time. So I obviously lived. I had major surgery in 2022 and then went through a couple years of physical therapy after that. And then in that time got about 5 or 6 more diagnoses and started figuring out what my life looked like as a chronically ill person. And I went from being an incredibly physically capable person to someone who couldn't get out of bed, sometimes for like months at a time. We're talking my husband had to help me walk to the bathroom. And if I'm being very honest, I hated her. I hated her in a way I had never felt about previous versions of me, even ones that felt very shame-filled. And I think I hated her so much for a couple reasons. I think one, I thought she was old enough to know better, experienced enough to do better. I had hoped she was mature enough to be better. But I think I hated her most because I'd seen who I could be when I loved myself well. And I don't remember the moment it happened. I don't remember the moment I fell out of love with myself. It just happened very slowly over time. And what I'm learning from this experience of falling in love with myself and then out of love with myself and now trying to get back to that good place with myself is that self-love is also a nuanced journey. Just because you find it doesn't mean it's a permanent destination. Things can come up, life can happen, and you can lose that connection to yourself. You can lose that love you have for yourself. But what I'm also finding is that much like our love for other people, our love for ourselves is an unconditional commitment. It's being willing to put in the work to find your way back. And in this case, to find your way back to yourself, no matter how hard it is or how long it takes. And so I've been working on that for a couple years now, and I found that self-love includes self-leadership. And when I say self-leadership, I mean reconnecting with that whole, undamaged self and letting that piece of you care for the other parts that are hurting with curiosity and compassion instead of shame and instead of judgment. And I'll give you an example. So when we started fostering, one of our kiddos had some behaviors that gave me a lot of anxiety. And I felt like, oh my gosh, I've got to address this now. I've got to address this now. And I realized over time, like, first of all, this is not effective. But secondly, this isn't about her. This is bringing up the panic 14-year-old me had when she felt like she wasn't going to be cared for or protected or get what she needed. And so I realized that while I still had a responsibility toward my foster kiddo to, help raise and parent them, what was going to help the most was if I parented that 14-year-old inside of me and looked upon her with love and gentleness and comforted her in those moments and told her, like, hey, it's okay. I've got you. I'm going to make sure you're protected. I'm going to make sure you have what you need. I see you. I hear you. I love you. And I'm here. I've had to do that with 5-year-old me, the version of me who was being sexually assaulted. And what she needs from me is safe love. And so that's something I can give that part of myself. I've got you now. I'll protect you now. I'll love you. I'll take care of you. And I think the two pieces of myself that are the hardest for me to grapple with are the pieces that were in my marriage and during that time when I was so severely ill. So my previous marriage, this one's getting better, but that piece of me could barely pick her head up for the longest time because there was just so much distress and shame. And here I am, I'm supposed to be this strong, empowered woman, and I let that man just beat me into the ground. Not physically, he never put his hands on me, but emotionally and mentally, the manipulation, the gaslighting, so many things. And just the distress that piece of me was in for so many years. Going back to her and lifting her chin up and telling her she's worthy and she's lovable, and I'll make sure she never finds herself in that situation again. And I'll be very honest, I'm still learning how to talk to the piece of myself that was so ill and that showed up in a way that was not what I would have hoped for myself. This might get emotional for me, but I tell her she's brave. And I tell her she's a survivor and a fighter, and she fucking made it. And she lived. And I tell her she's going to heal, that I'm going to heal her, and that she knows better now. And I trust her to do better now. And I tell her not to be so hard on herself. She was dying. And I take her to her doctor's appointments. And I do all the things and I take all the medications. But I try very hard to speak kindly to her. I think of all the pieces of me she hurts the most. So I try to tell my hypervigilant parts that they're safe now and they can rest. I try to tell my shame-filled parts that I see them beyond their mistakes. I try to tell the frightened parts that I'll protect them now. Maybe they didn't have an adult to protect them once upon a time, but they do now, and that adult is me. And I'll go to war for them. So I think this way back to loving myself is very different than the first time, because the first time I didn't know who I was. And this time I know who I am, and I lost her for a while. And I find the journey is most effective when I am tender with myself, with all of the parts of myself, when I have compassion and empathy, when I sit with and listen to them, when I take accountability for the moments that weren't the best or what I would have hoped they could be. So self-love isn't just bubble baths and manicures. I think the most effective forms of self-love are the messy ones, where we have to sit in the shit with ourselves and go, I see you, I accept you, I love you, and I'll take care of you. We have to listen to our anxieties and our fears and our joys and our despair. We have to listen to all of it and give it all a space and hold it with care so that it can quiet and rest. And the journey isn't linear. From what I've experienced, you can go a long time without loving yourself. Then you can fall deeply in love with yourself. And then you can fall out of love with yourself. And then you can go on the journey again. And I don't know how many times in the life I have left I'll go through this pattern of finding and losing and finding myself again. But what I know is that it's possible. And what I know is that it's worth it. And it's okay if I'm not there yet. If you're listening to this and this resonates with you, it's okay if you're not there yet too. We just have to be willing to start. Even if it's as small as figuring out what your favorite color is or your favorite meal. And eventually it grows to deep knowing and deep compassion and radical acceptance of yourself. And what I believe now is that there are many things I will do in my life that are deeply important. The relationships I build, the way I parent, the things I pursue in my career, the way I give back to my community. But the most important thing I will ever do is learn to sit with, accept, and truly see and love myself. And I hope you do too. Thanks for spending this time with me. Take what you need, leave the rest, and keep moving in the direction of your healing. If this episode resonated, share it with someone who needs it. That's how we all find each other. Subscribe to The Healing Life wherever you listen, and I'll see you in the next episode as the journey continues.